The rain hadn't stopped since 9. Nora Vance pedaled her old bicycle down the ramp into the underground parking garage beneath the Art Institute of Chicago, her soaked jacket clinging to her shoulders, her mind still spinning from a 10-hour shift, restoring a cracked 18th-century oil painting. She just wanted to cut through the garage, save 5 minutes, and get home to her cold apartment above the studio. She never even saw the car. It was tucked in the shadows of the executive section, past the yellow line she wasn't supposed to cross. Matte black, low to the ground, so sleek it looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a parking garage. Nora's pedal clipped the rear quarter panel with a screech of metal on metal, and she nearly went over the handlebars. Oh no, oh no, no, no. She dropped to her knees beside the car, running her fingers over a 6-inch scratch gouged into the paint. Under the dim garage lights, she could see the damage clearly, and worse, she could see the price tag practically radiating off the vehicle. This wasn't a car. This was somebody's fortune. Nora didn't know cars, but she knew materials. 10 years of restoration work had trained her eyes to recognize quality, and everything about this vehicle screamed money she couldn't imagine. Panic rose in her throat. She could run. Nobody had seen her. The garage camera blinked red in the corner. But maybe nobody would ever check the footage. Maybe... No, she wasn't that person. With shaking hands, she pulled a scrap of archival paper from her bike bag, the good, acid-free stuff she used for restoration notes, and a pencil that still smelled of graphite and turpentine. She wrote quickly, her handwriting cramped with anxiety. I am so sorry. I scratched your car with my bike pedal. It was completely my fault, and I take full responsibility. I don't have much, but I want to make this right. I can pay $150 a month, starting immediately. Please contact me at the number below. I'm also leaving what cash I have on me right now. She counted out $60, every bill in her wallet, folded it inside the note, and tucked both under the wiper blade with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Then she got back on her bike and pedaled home through the rain, feeling like she'd just confessed to a crime. She had no idea how right she was. 23 minutes later, Julian Vance, no relation, a coincidence Nora would never learn until much later, walked back into the garage, flanked by 2 men in dark suits who moved like they were paid to notice everything. At 26, Julian carried himself with the kind of stillness that made rooms go quiet. He wasn't the loudest man in the Chicago underworld. He didn't need to be. The Vance syndicate ran on precision, not noise, and Julian had built his reputation on being 3 moves ahead of anyone who thought otherwise. He noticed the wiper blade before he noticed the scratch. What is this? His voice was calm. It was always calm. That was what made people nervous. One of his lieutenants, a broad-shouldered man named Denny, plucked the paper and cash from under the blade and read it aloud. Julian listened without expression as the words washed over him. I'm so sorry. $150 a month. All I have. Then he crouched beside the scratch. Anger flickered through him first, sharp and immediate. This car had cost more than most people's houses. But Julian hadn't survived this long in his world by reacting on instinct. He pulled a small UV detailing pen from his coat pocket, a habit left over from his early years authenticating stolen goods before he ever ran a syndicate, and clicked it on over the wound in the paint. What he saw made him go very still. The scratch hadn't just chipped paint. It had scraped clean through a top layer that, under UV light, glowed faintly violet. A radar-absorbent clear coat, custom formulated, applied only by the 2 specialists who'd built this car for him 18 months ago. Beneath that layer, exposed by the girl's careless pedal, was something that shouldn't have been there at all, a carbon fiber weave. Fine, tight, expertly done, but wrong. Julian had personally overseen the construction of this vehicle. He knew, down to the gram, what materials had gone into its frame, a proprietary aerospace alloy blend, not carbon fiber. Not this carbon fiber. He ran his thumb along the exposed edge, felt the texture, and understood with a cold, creeping certainty that made his pulse pick up for the first time in years. This wasn't his car. It looked identical. It drove identical. Someone had built a flawless counterfeit and swapped it for the original, and Julian had been driving a $10 million lie for who knew how long, never once suspecting. He stood slowly, the note still folded in Denny's hand, the rain drumming steady on the garage's concrete overhead. "Pull the security footage," Julian said, his voice quiet in the way that made his men move fast. "Find this girl. Tonight." Denny hesitated. "Boss, it's just a scratch. She left cash and an apology." "It's not about the scratch." Julian was already walking toward the elevator, his mind racing through every transfer, every shipment, every trusted hand that had come near this car in the last year and a half. Someone inside his own organization had pulled off a switch this precise. Someone with resources, someone with access. And now, by pure accident, a stranger with a bicycle had cracked it open. "Find her," he said again. "She just showed me something I was never supposed to see." Nora hadn't slept. She'd spent half the night replaying the scratch in her mind, calculating how many months of ramen and canceled plans it would take to pay off a debt she couldn't even estimate. By 5:30, she gave up on sleep entirely and went downstairs to open her restoration studio early, hoping the familiar smell of linseed oil and old wood might calm her nerves. It didn't work. Nothing was working. At 6:30, she heard the engines. Nora looked up from the workbench, just in time to see two black SUVs glide to a stop outside her studio window, blocking the quiet brick street in both directions. Doors opened in unison. Men in dark suits stepped out first, scanning the street like they expected trouble, and then a third figure emerged from the middle vehicle, unhurried, adjusting the cuff of his jacket like he had all the time in the world. Nora's stomach dropped straight through the floor. She recognized the car before she recognized the man. Matte black, sleek. The same scratch, now cleaned but still faintly visible under the streetlight. "He found me." Her hands were shaking before he even reached the door. She'd read about things like this. Men who showed up at your business at dawn didn't do it to say good morning. She thought of every worst-case scenario in the span of 3 seconds. Broken kneecaps, threats against her studio, being dragged into an SUV and never seen again. The bell above her door chimed. Julian stepped inside, and the studio, usually so full of light and quiet purpose, suddenly felt very small. "Please!" Nora blurted before he'd said a single word, backing against her workbench, knocking over a jar of brushes that clattered to the floor. "Please. I already left the note. I meant every word. I can start paying today. I can get you more than $60. I just need a little time. I swear I'm not trying to run from this." Julian raised one hand, not unkindly, and she stopped talking. "I don't want your money," he said. The words didn't make sense to her. She stared at him, waiting for the rest of the threat, the part where he explained what he did want, because surely it was going to be worse than money. Instead, Julian reached into his coat and produced a slim tablet. He tapped the screen and turned it toward her, and Nora found herself looking at a series of high-resolution photographs, macro shots of the scratch, lit under ultraviolet light, showing layers of material she hadn't even known were there when her pedal clipped the paint. "Do you know what you did?" Julian asked. "I scratched your car." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "You did more than that." He stepped closer, angling the tablet so she could see better, and something in his tone shifted. The coldness of a man delivering a threat, replaced by something closer to genuine curiosity. Look at this layer here. Under the paint, Nora's fear didn't vanish, but it did something strange. It thinned, just slightly, pushed aside by the part of her brain that had spent a decade learning to read materials the way other people read faces. She leaned in despite herself, studying the photograph, and her professional instincts took over before her nerves could stop them. "That's not factory clear coat," she said slowly. "The refractive pattern is wrong. See how the light scatters here, in these tiny fracture lines? That's a radar-absorbent formulation. Expensive. Custom." She paused, frowning at the layer beneath it. "But that underneath, that's carbon fiber. High grade, but it's carbon fiber. If this was built the way I think it was built, that shouldn't be carbon fiber at all. It should be a metal alloy weave. Aerospace grade." Silence settled over the studio. Julian was staring at her now with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not anger, not suspicion. Something closer to recognition, like he'd been searching a crowded room for one specific face and had just found it in the last place he expected. "How do you know that?" he said quietly. "Just from a photograph?" Nora blinked, suddenly aware of how exposed she'd made herself, how she'd forgotten to be afraid for almost 30 seconds. It's my job. Material analysis. I restore antiques, art, sometimes vintage cars for collectors. You learn to read composition by sight. Optical refractivity, texture, weight distribution, it becomes instinct after enough years. Julian lowered the tablet slowly. "That car," he said, "was built for me 18 months ago. I approved every material specification myself. It was never supposed to contain carbon fiber." He let that sit for a moment, watching her face for a reaction she didn't fully understand yet. "Which means the car sitting in my garage right now isn't the one I paid for. Somebody swapped it. A perfect copy, down to the paint code, down to the interior stitching. And nobody noticed. Not my mechanics, not my security team, not me. Until I scratched it," Nora whispered, the pieces clicking together even as dread pooled in her chest. "Until you scratched it." Julian's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close. "You didn't damage my car, Ms. Vance. You handed me the first real evidence that someone close to me is stealing from me, and doing it well enough that I never would have found out." Nora's mind was racing now, fear and fascination tangled together in a knot she couldn't separate. "What does that have to do with me?" Julian studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies a tool he's just discovered he needs. "Because you just did in 30 seconds what my entire team of specialists failed to do in 18 months, he said. "And I think you're about to become very useful to me, Nora, whether you want to be or not." Outside, the sun was fully up now, spilling gold light across the wet Chicago street, and Nora had the distinct, sinking feeling that her quiet life had just ended. The boardroom on the top floor of Vance Syndicate headquarters had windows on 3 sides, glass floor to ceiling, so that Chicago spread out beneath them like a map someone had already conquered. Nora had never been anywhere like it in her life. She sat stiffly in a leather chair too large for her, clutching a folder of her studio's financial records that Julian's assistant had asked her to bring, though she still didn't fully understand why. Julian sat across the table, unbothered by the height, the wealth, the enormity of the room. To him, it was just Tuesday. "Before we start," he said, "I want to be clear about something. This isn't a threat. I know that's probably what you're expecting, given the circle you accidentally wandered into." "The thought crossed my mind," Nora admitted, and immediately regretted how honest that sounded. Julian's mouth twitched, almost a smile, gone before it fully formed. "Fair enough." He slid a folder across the polished table. "Open it." Nora opened it with shaking fingers, expecting contracts full of threats, disguised as legal language. Instead, She found something that made her breath catch in her throat. It was her studio's mortgage, paid in full, stamped, signed, closed. Beneath it, a second document. The outstanding restoration equipment loan she'd been drowning under for 3 years. The one that kept her up some nights doing math that never worked out. Also paid. Also closed. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I bought your debt," Julian said simply. "All of it. Your studio's mortgage, your equipment loans, even the small business loan you took out 2 years ago that's been accruing interest you can't keep up with. As of this morning, you owe nothing. To anyone." Nora's mind scrambled for the catch, because there was always a catch. Nothing in her life had ever come without a price attached, and she'd learned a long time ago not to trust generosity that arrived without explanation. "What do you want from me?" she said, and this time it wasn't a question so much as a demand. Julian leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same careful attention he'd given the scratch under the UV light. "I want your expertise. Nothing more, nothing less. You proved yesterday that you can identify material composition faster and more accurately than the specialists I already employ. I have a problem, Nora. Somewhere inside my organization, someone has access to my most valuable physical assets and the skill to replace them with counterfeits, good enough to fool everyone who should have caught it. I need someone who can audit what I own and tell me the truth about what's real. You want me to be a spy. I want you to be a scientist," Julian corrected. "Your role is strictly material analysis. You look, you test, you tell me what you find. That's all I'm asking. No violence, no danger, nothing beyond what you already do in that studio downstairs. Just on a larger, more secretive scale." Nora closed the folder slowly, her thumb tracing the edge of the paperwork that had just erased 3 years of financial terror. Every rational part of her screamed that this was too dangerous, that mafia and material science shouldn't exist in the same sentence, that she should thank him for the debt relief and run as far from this building as her legs would carry her. But another part of her, the part that had spent a lifetime being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed as the shy girl who talked more comfortably to paintings than to people, felt something she hadn't expected to feel in this room. She felt seen. "If I say yes," she said carefully, "what exactly does that make me?" "A consultant," Julian said. "Exclusive to me, highly compensated, fully protected, and completely removed from anything resembling the parts of my world you're worried about. You audit. You analyze. You never touch a gun, never see a body, never have to compromise who you are." He paused. "I don't need another soldier, Nora. I have plenty of those. I need someone whose eyes I can trust." The silence stretched long enough that Nora could hear her own heartbeat. "Okay," she finally said. "I'll do it." 3 floors below, in a private office with darker furniture and no windows at all, Marcus Reyes watched the boardroom feed on a small monitor with his jaw set tight. At 28, Marcus had spent 6 years clawing his way to the position of underboss, absorbing every insult, running every dirty errand, proving his loyalty in ways that had cost him more than Julian would ever know. He'd expected that loyalty to eventually translate into trust. Real trust. The kind where Julian brought him into every decision, instead of keeping him one careful step outside the inner circle. Instead, Julian was handing sensitive internal access to some outsider, a stranger, an art restorer who'd wandered into their world by accident, chubby and awkward and visibly terrified of her own shadow, and Julian was treating her like she'd been personally recruited from some elite intelligence agency. It didn't add up, and things that didn't add up made Marcus nervous. He pulled up a search terminal and began typing, his fingers quick and practiced. Nora Vance, Restoration Studio, West Loop, Chicago. Public records populated the screen. Birth certificate, business license, a modest life with modest debts that had apparently just vanished this morning, which was itself suspicious enough. But it was the third search result that made Marcus sit forward, his eyes narrowing. A missing persons filing. 7 years old. Dr. Aris Vance. Metallurgist. Presumed voluntarily absent. Last known contact with daughter Nora Vance. Marcus leaned back slowly, a thin, calculating smile spreading across his face for the first time all day. Everyone had a weak point. Everyone had something buried they didn't want dug up. He'd just found hers. The vault didn't look like a vault. That was the first thing Nora noticed, as Julian led her through a nondescript warehouse door in industrial South Chicago at 2 in the morning, past 2 guards who nodded without a word, into a freight elevator that dropped 3 stories underground. Most people expect something more dramatic, Julian said, watching her face as the doors opened. He wasn't wrong. What lay beyond the elevator wasn't dramatic. It was breathtaking. A climate-controlled chamber the size of a small airport hangar, filled with rows of vehicles under soft, museum-grade lighting. Vintage race cars beside restored classics. A section of shelving holding what looked like Renaissance-era sculpture. Glass cases of jewelry that could have funded a small country. Nora had spent her career around valuable things, but she'd never stood in a room that held this much wealth in one breath. "This is everything I've built," Julian said quietly, walking beside her. "Or what's left of it, apparently, if the counterfeits go deeper than the hypercar." Nora set down her equipment case on a steel table someone had rolled in for her. Spectroscopic scanners, a portable UV rig, small vials of solvent she used for testing composition without damaging the surface. Her hands, she noticed with some surprise, weren't shaking anymore. Fear had given way to focus. The same focus that used to carry her through 16-hour restoration sessions when a client's centuries-old painting depended on her not making a single wrong move. "Where do you want me to start?" she asked. "Everywhere," Julian said. "I need to know exactly how deep this goes." They worked for hours. Nora moved from piece to piece with methodical patience, running her scanner over surfaces, checking density readings against catalog specifications Julian's team had on file, testing paint layers and metal composition with a precision that made even Julian's most senior security officer, a quiet older man named Feld who'd trailed them at a respectful distance, raise his eyebrows more than once. The first false piece she found was a vintage motorcycle, supposedly restored from a 1960s frame. The metal alloy was wrong, by a margin so small, most experts would never catch it. The second was a sculpture, its base swapped for a resin composite, dressed up to look like aged bronze. The third made Julian go pale. A rare violin, its interior wood replaced with a synthetic substitute, engineered to fool even trained appraisers by sound alone. 3, Julian said quietly, staring at the growing list on Nora's tablet. 3 pieces, on top of the car. Someone has been doing this for a long time. And they're good, Nora added, almost to herself. Whoever's behind this isn't just skilled. They're an artist. These aren't rushed forgeries. Each one took real time, real expertise. Someone who understands materials at a level most professionals never reach. It was nearly dawn when she moved to the hypercar itself, still parked in its private bay at the center of the vault. The original scratch from that rainy Tuesday night, still faintly visible beneath a temporary paint seal. Nora crouched beside the open access panel Julian's mechanics had removed earlier, running her scanner along the interior frame where the counterfeit carbon fiber weave was most exposed. Her scanner beeped an anomaly, small, tucked into a fold of the resin matrix, where no one would think to look unless they were searching centimeter by centimeter. There's something here, Nora murmured, pulling a small pen light from her kit and angling it into the gap. She went very still, carved into the resin, so fine it looked almost like a manufacturing imperfection, unless you knew exactly what you were looking at, was a symbol. A stylized letter V, wrapped inside a small circle, with 3 tiny notches cut along its edge, in a pattern that meant nothing to anyone in the room, except Nora. Her breath caught somewhere in her chest and refused to move. Nora? Julian had crossed the vault floor without her noticing, crouching beside her, following her gaze to the tiny carved mark. What is it? Nora's hand trembled as she reached out, not quite touching the engraving, like it might disappear if she moved too fast. This is my father's mark, she whispered. He used to carve it into every piece he ever worked on. Jewelry, sculpture restorations, custom metalwork. It was his signature. He told me once, it was the one thing he'd never let anyone copy, because he made it up himself when he was little, before anyone else could ever use it. Your father, Julian repeated slowly. Dr. Careless Vance. The name came out cracked. 7 years of unresolved grief, pressed into 2 syllables. He was a metallurgist, one of the best in the country. That's actually where I got my start, watching him work when I was a kid. He disappeared when I was 20. Just vanished. He'd gotten into serious debt, some bad investments, people he owed money to, that I never fully understood. The police said he probably left the country to avoid it. I always thought, her voice broke slightly, I always thought he'd abandoned us. Abandoned me. Julian said nothing for a long moment, letting her sit with the weight of what she'd just found. He didn't abandon you, Julian said finally, his voice quiet but certain. Somebody's been forcing your father to build these counterfeits, Nora. This mark isn't decoration. It's a message. He's alive, and he's telling us he's still out there. Nora stared at the tiny engraving until it blurred through tears she hadn't given herself permission to cry in years. Whatever she had signed up for 3 days ago in that glass boardroom, audits, analysis, quiet consulting work, had just become something else entirely. This wasn't Julian's mystery anymore. It was hers. Nora didn't sleep after the vault. She sat at the steel table until sunrise, running the resin sample from the hypercar's frame through every test her portable kit allowed, chasing the one question that mattered more than any other. Where was this material cured? By 7 in the morning, she had an answer. And by 8, she was standing in Julian's private hangar, watching a sleek white jet get fueled on the tarmac, still wearing yesterday's clothes and running on nothing but adrenaline and old coffee. You're certain, Julian said, watching her pace beside the aircraft stairs. I'm certain about the chemistry, Nora said, pulling up the data on her tablet. This composite resin, the one used in the fake carbon fiber weave, it's not something you can cure just anywhere. It needs a specific humidity and salt mineral exposure during the curing process, or the molecular bonding fails and the material becomes brittle within months. I've seen this exact curing signature once before, in a restoration journal about maritime shipbuilding composites. She looked up at him. It has to be cured near salt water, in a controlled industrial environment, somewhere with the right climate and the right equipment. Julian's jaw tightened. I have a maritime logistics division, a port facility in Miami. Then that's where your father's counterfeits are being made, Nora said quietly. Or at least where they were finished. Julian didn't hesitate. Within the hour, they were airborne. The cabin of Julian's jet was quieter than Nora expected, all soft leather and low light, and for the first time since the scratch, she found herself sitting across from Julian with nothing urgent demanding her attention. Just the hum of engines and 30,000 feet of empty sky. You didn't have to come with me, Julian said, breaking the silence somewhere over Kentucky. I could have sent a team to Miami and had them report back. I need to see it myself, Nora said. Chemical composition isn't something you can describe over a phone call. I need to test the site directly, and besides, she hesitated, staring out at the clouds. If my father is connected to this, I need to be there. I can't just wait in Chicago for someone else to tell me what happened to him. Julian studied her for a long moment, something unguarded crossing his face that she hadn't seen from him before. Not the calculated calm of the boardroom, not the sharp focus of the vault, but something quieter, almost gentle. "You're braver than you think you are," he said. Nora let out a short, humorless laugh. "I nearly threw up when your car showed up outside my studio. That's not what I mean." Julian leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "Most people, when their world gets turned upside down the way yours has this week, they fold, they panic, they run, they beg to be left out of it. You didn't do any of that. You picked up a scanner and started working. You found evidence my own security team missed for 18 months. And now you're flying toward a truth about your father that could break your heart all over again. And you're doing it anyway." He shook his head slightly. "That's not luck, Nora. That's courage. I don't think you give yourself enough credit for it." Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to being looked at like that, like someone had actually taken the time to see past the shyness, past the nervous stammering, into whatever was underneath. She'd spent so much of her life feeling invisible, the quiet girl in the corner of every room, that she didn't quite know what to do with a man like Julian, looking at her as though she were formidable. "Thank you," she said softly, and meant it more than the words could carry. Miami's port facility sprawled along the coastline in a maze of shipping containers, cranes, and salt-heavy air that hit Nora the moment she stepped off the jet. Julian's logistics division ran a legitimate shipping operation here. Legal on paper, profitable, the kind of business that made excellent cover for exactly the sort of operation they were hunting. Dressed in a borrowed customs inspector's jacket that Julian's team had produced within the hour, Nora moved through rows of incoming containers with a portable scanner disguised inside an ordinary clipboard case, testing crate after crate under the guise of a routine inspection. Julian stayed several containers back, watching from a discreet distance with two of his men, letting her work without hovering. It took nearly 3 hours before her scanner spiked. The container was marked as industrial auto parts, bound for redistribution across 3 continents. Nora ran her scanner along the seams and felt her stomach drop as the readout confirmed what she already suspected. "Julian," she called quietly into the small radio clipped to her collar. "I found it." He reached her within minutes, and together they pried open the container's inspection panel. Inside, stacked in careful rows and packed in protective foam, were dozens of structural frame components. The same false carbon fiber weave, the same radar-absorbent coating, the same precision craftsmanship that could only belong to one man's hands. "There's enough material here to replace assets across your entire distribution network," Nora said, her voice tight. "This isn't a one-time theft, Julian. This is a system. Someone's been slowly swapping out your real assets and shipping the originals out for sale, piece by piece, for who knows how long." Julian stared into the container in silence, his expression carved from something colder than she'd seen from him yet. "Someone with access to my shipping routes," he said slowly. "Someone who knows exactly which containers to intercept, and when. That's not an outsider's job." His eyes met hers, grim and certain. "That's someone inside my own circle." Nora thought of the tiny V carved into the resin, of her father's hands, somewhere out there forced into this work, and felt the ground of her old, quiet life fall away completely. Whoever was doing this wasn't just stealing from Julian. They were close enough to touch him. The penthouse ballroom glittered above Miami's waterfront, all glass walls and candlelight reflecting off the dark ocean beyond. Julian had called it an elite gathering, a chance to observe his inner circle in a setting relaxed enough that people let their guard down. Nora understood, walking in on his arm in a deep emerald gown his assistant had procured with almost frightening efficiency, that this wasn't a party. It was a trap, and everyone here was both bait and suspect. "You look terrified," Julian murmured beside her, guiding her past a cluster of syndicate lieutenants who tracked their entrance with open curiosity. "I am terrified," Nora whispered back. "I restore paintings for a living. I don't know how to work a room full of criminals in formal wear." "You don't have to work the room." His hand settled briefly, steady, at the small of her back. "Just stay close to me and watch faces. You're better at reading people than you think. You read a scratch on a car and unraveled my entire operation. Faces will be easier." It should have sounded absurd. Instead, it settled something in her chest. For the first 2 hours, Julian kept her at his side, introducing her simply as his material consultant, watching the way certain men's eyes lingered too long on her, cataloging reactions with the same quiet precision she used on chemical samples. Nora felt the weight of every stare. The shy art restorer standing beside the boss, an oddity nobody in this world had a category for. But Julian never once let her feel small for it. If anything, he stood a little closer, a little more deliberately, as though daring anyone in the room to underestimate her twice. It was near midnight, during a lull when Julian had been pulled aside by 2 senior directors, that Marcus found her alone near the balcony doors. "Miss Vance." His smile was warm, practiced, the kind of smile Nora had learned in the last week to distrust instinctively. "You've made quite an impression. Julian doesn't bring outsiders this close, not usually." "I'm not really an outsider," Nora said carefully. "I'm a consultant." "Of course." Marcus glanced toward Julian's distant figure, then back at her, his voice dropping lower. "I wonder if we could speak privately. It concerns your father." Nora's whole body went rigid. Marcus watched the reaction land, satisfaction flickering behind his eyes, and gestured toward a quiet alcove near the balcony where the music and conversation faded to a low murmur. Nora followed, every instinct screaming that this was a mistake, and did it anyway, because the words your father had cut straight through every ounce of caution she owned. "What do you know about him?" she said, once they were alone. Marcus produced a folded document from inside his jacket. Financial records, transaction histories, wire transfers routed through a web of shell accounts. He held it just out of her reach, letting her see enough to recognize the pattern without letting her take it. "Your father has been very busy," Marcus said. "These transfers trace back to accounts linked directly to the counterfeit operation. Someone's been paying him. Someone's been receiving payment through channels he controls." He let that settle. "It's a compelling theory, don't you think? Missing metallurgist, deep in debt, disappears for 7 years, and now his signature turns up carved into stolen assets worth tens of millions. Julian's people are thorough, Nora. Sooner or later, someone else is going to draw the same conclusion I did, that your father isn't a victim in this. He's the mastermind." "That's not true," Nora said, but her voice cracked on the second word. Doubt she didn't want to feel creeping in despite herself. "Maybe not," Marcus said, almost gently, "but it doesn't matter what's true. It matters what Julian's enforcers believe when they find this evidence, and they will find it, because I intend to make sure of it. Unless," he paused deliberately, "unless you help me first." "Help you how?" "You have access to the vault now. Full trust. Whatever chemical analysis you run, whatever findings you report to Julian, he takes as gospel." Marcus's voice was smooth, reasonable, the voice of a man who'd rehearsed this moment. "I need you to adjust your next report. Point the evidence somewhere else, someone convenient. In exchange, I make sure this," he tapped the folded document, "never reaches Julian's desk. Your father stays a missing person instead of a wanted man. Simple trade. Nora stared at him, her mind racing through everything Julian had shown her, everything she'd learned in the vault. The sick calculation now laid bare in front of her. Marcus wasn't asking her to save her father. He was asking her to become exactly what he'd accused her father of being, a tool used to steal from Julian, quietly, from the inside. And if I say no? Marcus's smile didn't waver. Then this evidence finds its way to the wrong people by morning, and your father becomes the syndicate's most wanted man. Along with you, most likely, given how close you've gotten to Julian this week. Guilt by association tends to travel fast in our world. Out across the ballroom, Nora could see Julian's silhouette through the crowd, still deep in conversation, unaware of the quiet ultimatum being delivered 20 feet away. She thought of the tiny V carved into the resin, of her father's hands somewhere forced into this exact kind of deception, of Julian's voice on the plane telling her she was braver than she thought. She thought of everything Marcus was asking her to become, and everything it would cost her to refuse. I need time, Nora managed, her voice barely steady. You have until sunrise. Marcus tucked the document back inside his jacket, his expression pleasant, patient, utterly without mercy. Choose carefully, Miss Vance. Your father's life depends on it, so I imagine, does your own. He walked away, melting back into the glittering crowd as though he hadn't just handed her an impossible choice. And Nora stood alone at the balcony's edge, the ocean dark and endless beyond the glass, feeling the ground of her new life crack open beneath her feet, for the second time in a week. Nora found Julian on the balcony at 3 a.m, long after the gala had thinned to a handful of stragglers and the ocean below had gone black and silent under a moonless sky. He was alone, jacket discarded over a chair, sleeves rolled to his forearms, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating on the railing beside him. She'd spent 3 hours arguing with herself, 3 hours weighing her father's safety against her loyalty to a man she'd known for less than a week, turning Marcus's offer over and over until the shape of it stopped changing, no matter how she looked at it. In the end, there had only ever been one answer she could live with. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to let me finish before you react. Julian turned, and whatever he saw in her face made the easy calm of the evening drain out of him immediately. Nora, what happened? She told him everything. Marcus's approach, the folded financial records, the accusation against her father, the ultimatum to falsify her reports by sunrise, or watch her father, and possibly herself, get thrown to the syndicate's enforcers as thieves. Her voice shook through most of it, but she didn't stop, didn't soften it, didn't leave out the part where doubt had crept in, where for one terrible moment she'd wondered if Marcus's evidence might actually be true. When she finished, she braced herself for anger, for betrayal, disappointment, the cold fury she'd seen flicker across his face once already over a scratched car. Instead, Julian exhaled slowly and looked out at the dark water, and something in his posture told her this wasn't a surprise at all. I know, he said quietly. Nora blinked. You know? Since when? Since Miami. Maybe before. Julian turned to face her fully now, his expression unreadable in the low light. Marcus has been careful, but not careful enough. He's requested access to shipping manifests he had no operational reason to see. He's been in contact with a corporate intelligence firm out of Geneva under an alias. My financial team flagged the wire transfers 3 weeks ago, before you ever scratched my car. I didn't have proof of what he was doing. I didn't know how deep it went, or who else was involved. But I've suspected Marcus for over a month. Then why didn't you say anything? Nora's voice cracked between disbelief and something closer to hurt. You let me walk into that ballroom completely unprepared. He could have... I know what he could have done, Julian said, and for the first time, Real weight pressed into his voice. I didn't warn you because I needed to know exactly how he'd move, and against who. If I'd tipped my hand too early, he would have buried the evidence and waited for a better moment. I needed him to expose himself. He stopped, jaw tightening. I didn't expect him to come at you. That was a miscalculation. I'm sorry. The apology landed somewhere Nora hadn't expected, softening the anger before it could fully take hold. She studied him for a long moment, searching for the calculation she was used to seeing behind his eyes, and found something else there instead, genuine regret, and beneath it, real concern that had nothing to do with strategy. Tell me about my father, she said. All of it. No more half-truths. Julian nodded slowly. I believe Marcus found your father years ago, desperate, in debt, exactly the kind of man someone could pressure into working for them. I think Marcus has been holding something over him ever since, forcing him to build these counterfeits while making sure the money trail pointed nowhere near himself. Your father's signature in that resin wasn't a mistake, Nora. I think it was a message. He wanted someone to find it. He wanted me to find it, Nora whispered, the pieces settling into place with a clarity that made her chest ache. He knew I'd recognize his mark. He's been trying to reach me this whole time. I think so, Julian said gently. Nora wiped her eyes quickly, forcing herself back toward the practical, the part of this she could actually control. Marcus wants me to falsify my report, point the evidence somewhere else. Then we give him exactly what he wants, Julian said, and for the first time that night, something sharp and purposeful crept back into his voice. Except we control what he thinks he's getting. Nora frowned. A counter-trap. You're going to file your report, Julian said, pulling a chair closer and sitting across from her. All business now. The earlier softness folded neatly away, beneath strategy. But instead of pointing away from Marcus, we're going to build a false trail that makes it look like the operation is unraveling, like the stolen assets are being consolidated for a final sale. Something urgent enough that Marcus panics and moves fast, before he's ready. Men who panic make mistakes they wouldn't otherwise make. And if he doesn't take the bait, he will, Julian said with quiet certainty. Marcus has been patient for years, waiting for his moment. If he thinks that moment is slipping away, thinks someone else might beat him to the real payout, he won't be able to help himself. Greed doesn't wait for good judgment. Nora sat with that for a long moment, watching the first pale hint of dawn edge along the horizon over the water. 3 days ago, she'd been terrified of the man sitting across from her. Now she was helping him build a trap sharp enough to bring down his own second-in-command. And somewhere in the middle of that, quietly, without either of them quite naming it, something had shifted between them that had nothing to do with debts or contracts or stolen resin. Where does the trail lead him? She asked. Julian's eyes were steady, already 3 moves ahead. Zurich, he said. That's where this ends. The false trail worked exactly as Julian predicted. Within 48 hours of Nora filing her doctored report, one that suggested the syndicate's internal auditors were closing in fast on the stolen assets, forcing an urgent liquidation, Julian's financial intelligence team intercepted chatter confirming Marcus had scheduled an offshore transaction. A private banking vault in Zurich, timed for Wednesday afternoon, where the genuine $10 million hypercar and several other stolen originals would be sold to an anonymous international buyer before anyone could trace them back to him. He's rattled, Julian said, reading the intercepted communications on the jet as it crossed the Atlantic. Moving faster than he wants to. That's good. Rattled men make careless choices. Nora sat across from him, going over her own preparation, customs documentation, restricted materials registries, international art conservation statutes. She'd spent the last 2 days memorizing until the language blurred together. Julian had insisted she come, not as a bystander this time, but as the linchpin of the plan itself. "You're sure about this?" she said, not for the first time. "The moment I trigger this freeze, there's no undoing it. If I've read the regulation wrong—" "You haven't," Julian said simply. "You've read it 3 times and found the same answer each time. Trust yourself the way I trust you." Zurich in the late afternoon looked like something out of a postcard. Cobblestone streets, precise architecture, snow-capped mountains visible in the distance beyond the lake. The private bank vault sat inside an unassuming stone building near the financial district, the kind of place built specifically to make enormous wealth look boring and unremarkable to anyone passing by. Julian's team moved with careful discipline. No weapons drawn, no threats made. This wasn't a fight to be won with force, and Julian had been clear from the beginning that this ending needed to happen legally, cleanly, in a way that would strip Marcus of everything without a single shot fired. Nora, dressed once again in a borrowed customs official's credentials, this time genuine, arranged through a contact Julian's legal team had cultivated over years, walked into the Freeport facility with a folder of documentation and a steadiness in her chest she wouldn't have believed possible a week ago. The vault manager, a precise Swiss banker named Herr Brandt, greeted her with polite skepticism. "You understand this facility operates under strict client confidentiality. I cannot simply allow an unscheduled inspection." "I'm not asking you to," Nora said, sliding her documentation across the counter. "I'm informing you, under European Union cultural property regulation, that I have credible evidence this vault contains unregistered historical materials subject to immediate customs freeze." Specifically, she pulled out the vault's shipping manifest her team had obtained, tracing her finger down the list. "This consignment, registered as automotive components, actually contains restored aerospace-grade alloy sourced from a historically protected metallurgical process. Under Article 4 of the Cultural Property Transfer Act, any transaction involving these materials requires prior registration with cultural heritage authorities. This shipment has none." Brandt's polite skepticism faltered as he scanned the documentation, his eyes catching on the regulatory citations Nora had underlined and cross-referenced with a precision that left no room for argument. She'd spent 2 sleepless nights making sure of exactly that. "This is—" he frowned, flipping through the pages again. "This is remarkably specific." "It's accurate," Nora said. "And if this transaction proceeds without registration, your institution becomes legally liable alongside the seller. I'd imagine that's not a risk your bank wants to take." 20 minutes later, the freeze was in place. Official, documented, backed by regulation airtight enough that no lawyer Marcus could hire would unwind it quickly. Every account tied to the shipment, every transfer scheduled against it, locked down by European Customs Authority before a single item could change hands. Marcus arrived at the facility 40 minutes later, expecting to finalize the sale of a lifetime, and instead found Swiss customs officials waiting alongside his own legal counsel, informing him that his transaction, and every account connected to it, had just been frozen, pending federal investigation. Nora watched from a discreet distance beside Julian as Marcus's composure cracked in real time, his easy charm evaporating into barely controlled fury as he realized, piece by piece, exactly how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. "This is impossible," Marcus snapped at Brandt, his voice carrying across the marble lobby. "This paperwork is fabricated. Someone's manipulated the registry." "The registry is accurate," Nora said, stepping forward before she could stop herself, her voice steadier than she'd ever imagined it could be, in front of a man who'd threatened her father's life. "I verified it myself. Every citation, every classification. You built your entire operation on materials you assumed no one would ever look at closely enough to recognize. You were wrong." Marcus turned toward her slowly, understanding dawning with cold, furious clarity. You, he said. This was you. This was justice, Julian said, stepping up beside her, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made the entire lobby go still. You gave her an ultimatum in Miami, Marcus. Falsify evidence or watch her father die. She came to me instead. Everything you tried to build to protect yourself, she just used to bury you. Marcus's eyes flicked between them, calculating, searching for an exit that no longer existed. Security officers were already moving toward him, flanking the exits with the quiet efficiency of men who'd been briefed hours in advance. You think this ends it? Marcus said, his voice low, venomous. You think freezing an account stops what I know? I have contacts, Julian. People who'd love to know exactly how you run your empire, exactly how vulnerable you really are, underneath all this control. Then talk to them from a jail cell, Julian said calmly. Your accounts are frozen. Your contacts have already been notified of the fraud investigation attached to your name, and every asset you tried to steal is about to be returned to its rightful place. You lost, Marcus, not with a gun, with paperwork. Nora watched Marcus's face collapse from fury into something closer to disbelief as Swiss authorities moved in, and felt, for the first time since a rainy Tuesday night with a bicycle pedal and an apology note, something close to peace settle over her. But peace didn't last long. Because Marcus's threat still hung in the air, unresolved, and somewhere out there, her father was still missing, still held by whatever remained of the operation Marcus had built around him. The fight in Zurich was over. The one that mattered most hadn't started yet. The estate sat on the edge of Lake Lucerne, half hidden behind a curtain of pines, the kind of property built specifically to be forgotten by anyone who didn't already know it existed. Julian's team had traced it within hours of Marcus's arrest. A shell company, 3 layers removed from his name, quietly leasing the property for the better part of 2 years. This is where he's been, Nora said, staring at the satellite images spread across the table in their hotel suite, her voice tight with a hope she was almost afraid to feel. This whole time, 2 hours from where we just stood. We move tonight, Julian said, before word of Marcus's arrest spreads far enough for whoever's guarding that estate to panic and disappear. Nora insisted on coming, and this time Julian didn't argue. She'd earned that much, and they both knew it. The infiltration happened just after midnight, quiet and precise. No gunfire, no chaos. Julian had learned long ago that violence left evidence, and evidence left consequences. Instead, his team moved with local law enforcement warrants secured hours earlier through contacts his legal counsel had cultivated for exactly this kind of situation, disarming the estate's private security through sheer procedural authority rather than force. 2 guards were detained without incident. A third, once shown the paperwork proving Marcus's operation had just collapsed in Zurich, simply put down his weapon and asked how quickly he could cut a deal. Nora barely registered any of it. Her whole body was focused on one thing, the workshop at the rear of the estate, lit from within by a single lamp, visible through a narrow window as Julian led her across the dark lawn. She saw him before she was ready to. Dr. Eris Vance sat hunched over a workbench, older than she remembered, his hair fully gray now, his hands still steady, still precise, still unmistakably her father's hands, carefully setting down a tool as the door opened and light spilled in from the hallway. He looked up, squinting against the brightness, and for a moment Nora thought her heart might actually stop. Nora, his voice cracked on her name, 7 years of silence, collapsing into a single word. He stood too fast, nearly knocking over the chair behind him, and then she was across the room and in his arms before either of them could say another word, both of them shaking, both of them crying in a way that neither tried to hide. "I thought you'd left us," she managed, muffled against his shoulder. "I thought you abandoned me." "Never," her father said, gripping her tighter, his voice raw. "Never, Nora. I swear to you, I never wanted any of this." It took nearly an hour, once the estate was fully secured and Julian had given them privacy in a small sitting room, for Dr. Vance to tell the whole story. He'd fallen into debt years earlier through a business partner's fraud, losing nearly everything, and Marcus had found him at his most desperate, offering to erase the debt in exchange for one favor, then another, then a demand he couldn't refuse without endangering the life he'd built for Nora from a distance. "He threatened you," Dr. Vance said quietly, watching his daughter's face. "From the very beginning. He told me if I ever reached out, if I ever tried to explain, he'd make sure something happened to you. So I stayed silent. I let you believe I'd abandoned you, rather than risk him following through." His hands trembled around the mug of tea Julian's staff had brought him. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every single day. The mark," Nora said. "In the resin. You put it there on purpose." Her father nodded slowly, something like relief crossing his exhausted face. "I hoped, if anyone ever looked closely enough, it would be you. I knew if my mark surfaced, you were the only person in the world who'd recognize it immediately. And I knew you were the only person who might actually be trusted enough to do something about it. It was a message with no return address, but I prayed it would find you." He reached out and took her hand. "It did. You found me, Nora. After everything, you're the one who found me." Julian, who had been standing quietly near the doorway giving them space, stepped forward now, and Dr. Vance looked up at him with an expression that shifted from wariness to something closer to gratitude, as Nora quickly explained who he was and everything that had happened over the last 2 weeks. "You saved her," Dr. Vance said finally, rising slowly to shake Julian's hand, his grip firm despite everything his body had clearly endured. "And you saved me, whether you intended to or not. I don't know how I'll ever repay that." "You already have," Julian said. "Your daughter is the reason Marcus is in custody instead of walking free with half my fortune. She's the reason this ends tonight instead of dragging on for years. If anything, I owe you both a debt I can't easily repay." Dr. Vance studied Julian for a long moment, then glanced at his daughter, at the way she stood slightly closer to Julian than professional distance required, at the quiet, unspoken current running between them that neither of them had fully acknowledged yet, even to themselves. "I see," he said, a faint, knowing smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. "Well, I suppose I have you to thank for more than just my freedom then." Nora flushed deeply and opened her mouth to protest, but Julian only smiled, the first fully unguarded smile she'd seen from him since this entire impossible story began, and said nothing at all, which somehow felt like more of an answer than any words could have offered. Outside, dawn was breaking pale gold over Lake Lucerne, the mountains catching the first light, and for the first time in 7 years, Nora Vance stood beside both the father she'd thought she'd lost and a man who'd rebuilt her entire world from a single scratch on a car, and felt, finally, that the worst of it was truly behind her. One battle remained, but it wouldn't require force. It would require the truth, spoken plainly, in front of the only people whose judgment still mattered. The council chamber in Geneva had been used for exactly this purpose for nearly 40 years. A long, dark wood table surrounded by the senior directors of the Vance Syndicate, men who controlled fortunes across 3 continents and answered to almost no one except each other and, ultimately, Julian himself. Nora had never seen a room feel so heavy with history and consequence, every chair occupied by someone whose word could end careers, end lives, end entire operations with a single nod. She stood near the wall beside her father, both of them still adjusting to freedom that had arrived only days earlier, watching as Julian took his place at the head of the table with the same calm authority she'd first seen in her studio doorway 2 weeks ago. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then. "You all know why we're here," Julian said, his voice carrying easily through the room without needing to rise. "Marcus Reyes has been operating a counterfeiting scheme inside this syndicate for nearly 2 years, replacing genuine assets with forgeries and selling the originals through an outside intelligence network based in this city. He forced a skilled metallurgist into servitude to accomplish it, threatened the man's daughter to ensure his silence, and when that daughter uncovered the truth by accident, he attempted to blackmail her into covering his tracks." Marcus sat at the far end of the table, hands cuffed loosely in front of him under the watch of 2 guards, his lawyer beside him, already preparing objections that everyone in the room understood would carry no real weight here. This tribunal didn't answer to civil court. It answered to its own code, and Marcus had broken every article of it. "This is absurd," Marcus said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Circumstantial evidence, coerced testimony from a frightened girl and her desperate father." "It's not circumstantial," Julian said calmly, and nodded toward Nora. She stepped forward, her heart pounding but her hands steady, and laid out the documentation she'd spent the last 2 days organizing with painstaking care. Chemical analysis reports comparing the counterfeit materials to genuine specifications. The shipping manifests from Miami cross-referenced against Marcus's authorized access logs. The Zurich transaction records showing the frozen accounts tracing directly back to shell companies registered under aliases Marcus had used for over a year. "Every counterfeit piece shares the same curing signature," Nora said, her voice growing steadier with each sentence. The shy stammer of 2 weeks ago, replaced by the calm precision of someone standing fully in her expertise. Every shipment moved through ports. Marcus had specific authorization to access, at times that align exactly with gaps in the official manifest logs he personally approved. And this, she placed the folded financial document Marcus had shown her at the Miami gala on the table, the same one he'd used to threaten her, is the evidence he tried to use to frame my father as the mastermind, in exchange for my silence. He handed me this himself. His own fingerprints are on it. A murmur moved through the council directors. Glances exchanged down the length of the table. Nora's father spoke next, quiet but resolute, describing 2 years of captivity, the threats made against his daughter's life, the careful signature he'd hidden in the resin as a last desperate hope that someone would find him. By the time they finished, the room had gone utterly silent. Julian let the silence stretch, giving every director time to absorb the full weight of what had been laid before them, before he spoke again. "Over $100 million in stolen assets," he said. "A metallurgist held against his will. A direct threat made against an innocent civilian to cover a betrayal of this syndicate's most basic law, loyalty to the family that raised you. Marcus didn't just steal from me. He stole from every director in this room, because every one of you trusted him with access that made this theft possible." Marcus's composure finally broke. "You don't understand what it's like," he snapped, straining against the guard's grip, "spending 6 years proving yourself to a man who never once considered making you an equal partner instead of a subordinate. I built half of what this syndicate controls today, and you rewarded me with scraps, while outsiders got your trust handed to them freely. I rewarded you with more responsibility than any lieutenant in this organization's history," Julian said, his voice hardening for the first time all evening. "You mistook trust for ownership, Marcus. This syndicate was never yours to steal from, no matter how much you told yourself you'd earned it." The senior director seated closest to Julian's right, an elderly man named Costa, whose word carried weight second only to Julian's own, finally spoke, his voice gravelly with age and absolute certainty. "The evidence is undisputed. I move that Marcus Reyes be stripped of all rank and standing within this syndicate, effective immediately, and remanded to international financial crime authorities for prosecution." One by one, down the length of the table, the directors voted, unanimous. Marcus was still shouting protests as the guards led him from the chamber, his voice echoing down the marble hallway until a heavy door swallowed the sound completely, and then the room was quiet again. 12 powerful men and one recovering victim's family, absorbing the finality of what had just happened. Julian rose from his seat and addressed the remaining directors with a calm that settled over the room like a closing statement. "Let this stand as proof," he said, "that this syndicate is not won through deception or violence. It's won through loyalty, through intelligence, and through the willingness to trust the right people, even when they arrive from outside the world we already know." His gaze shifted, briefly, unmistakably, toward Nora. Sometimes those people prove more valuable than anyone born into it. No one in the room challenged him. No one dared. As the directors filed out, offering quiet nods of respect toward Nora and her father on their way, Julian crossed the chamber and stood before them both, the weight of 2 exhausting weeks finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. "It's over," he said simply. Nora looked at her father, whole and free beside her, and then at Julian, who'd rebuilt her entire world from the wreckage of a single accidental scratch, and felt something settle deep in her chest that she hadn't dared to name until this exact moment. "Not quite everything," she said softly. "I think there's still one thing left unresolved." Julian's mouth curved into a small, knowing smile. "I was hoping you'd say that." A month had passed since Geneva, and the conservation laboratory Julian had built for her sat perched above Lake Geneva like something out of a dream Nora hadn't let herself have. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the water and the mountains beyond, sunlight pouring across workbenches outfitted with equipment she'd only ever read about in academic journals. Spectrometers precise enough to analyze molecular structures invisible to the naked eye. Climate-controlled restoration bays built to museum specifications. An entire wing dedicated to the kind of material science research she'd once only dreamed of pursuing from the cramped back room of her West Loop studio. She stood at the center of it now, running her palm along the edge of a workbench that was entirely, undeniably hers, and still couldn't quite believe it was real. Her father worked 2 floors below, in a metallurgy lab of his own that Julian had insisted on building the moment the paperwork for Nora's facility was finalized. Dr. Vance had spent the last month doing what he loved most, restoring, creating, teaching a handful of young apprentices the craft he'd nearly lost forever, and for the first time in 7 years, Nora fell asleep each night without the low hum of grief that had followed her since his disappearance. He was safe. He was here. He was, finally, home. The last piece of unfinished business sat in the private garage adjoining the laboratory, covered by a soft cloth, waiting. Nora heard the door open behind her and didn't need to turn around to know it was Julian. She'd learned the particular rhythm of his footsteps over the last month, the unhurried confidence of a man who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, least of all her. "You've been standing in here for 20 minutes, Julian said, crossing the room to stand beside her at the window. "Feld told me you left the tribunal celebration early last night to come sit in an empty lab. I was starting to worry you preferred the equipment to the company. I just needed to see it," Nora said, smiling despite herself. "Make sure it was still real. Every morning, I half expect to wake up back in my old studio, wondering if I imagined all of this. It's real," Julian said quietly. "All of it." He'd changed in the weeks since Zurich, or maybe she'd simply learned to see him more clearly. The careful calm that had once seemed cold to her now read as something closer to steadiness. A man who'd spent his whole life keeping tight control over an empire built on danger, finally allowing himself to be unguarded around one person in the world. Nora had changed too. The girl who'd stammered apologies at gunpoint 2 weeks after this began had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who'd faced down a syndicate underboss with nothing but documentation and refused to back down. "I have something for you," Julian said, and gestured toward the adjoining garage. "Come see." Nora followed him through the connecting door, and there it sat, under soft laboratory lighting. The hypercar, fully restored, its matte black finish, flawless from every angle. She circled it slowly, running her fingers along the rear quarter panel, where, weeks ago, her bicycle pedal had scraped away a hidden truth neither of them could have predicted. There was no trace of the scratch left, not a single mark. She'd restored it herself, painstakingly, over 3 long nights in her new lab, treating it with the same reverence she'd give any priceless piece of art. Because in every way that mattered, that's exactly what it had become to her. "You did beautiful work," Julian said, watching her study the panel. "I had a lot of motivation," Nora said softly. "This car changed my entire life. Seemed only fair to give it my very best." Julian reached into his jacket and produced a small set of keys, the metal catching the light as he held them out to her. Not toward the passenger seat, not as a courtesy ride. He placed them directly into her palm and closed her fingers around them gently. "It's yours," he said. Nora stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Julian, this car is worth—" "I know exactly what it's worth," he said. "I also know it's the reason I found you. If you hadn't scratched it, I never would have discovered the counterfeit. I never would have walked into your studio that morning. I never would have learned what it feels like to trust someone completely, outside of blood or business, for the first time in my life." His voice softened, losing every trace of the calculated calm she'd first met in that boardroom. "This car brought you into my world, Nora. It only feels right that it belongs to you now." Nora's throat tightened, the keys warm and solid in her closed fist. 2 weeks of fear and courage and heartbreak and discovery collapsing into a single, overwhelming moment. "I came into your world with an apology note and $60, she said, laughing despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I never imagined it would end like this." "Neither did I," Julian admitted, stepping closer, close enough that the space between them nearly disappeared entirely. "I've built an empire on always knowing what happens next. You're the only thing that's ever completely surprised me. Is that a compliment?" "It's the highest one I have." Outside the laboratory windows, sunlight spilled gold and endless across Lake Geneva, catching the water in a way that made the whole world look freshly made. Nora thought of the frightened woman who'd knelt beside a stranger's car on a rainy Chicago night, certain her life was about to fall apart, and understood now, standing in a laboratory built entirely for her brilliance, beside a man who'd seen her worth before she'd ever seen it herself, that it hadn't fallen apart at all. It had simply, finally, begun. Julian reached for her hand, and Nora let him take it. The restored hypercar gleaming behind them like a promise neither of them needed to say out loud anymore. Some scratches, it turned out, didn't ruin things. Some of them revealed exactly what had been hidden underneath all along.